Hi, it's Naomi Wolf, author of The End of America. In 2008, I wrote that book, The End of America, Letter of Warning to a Young Patriot. I warned in it, based on my study of closing democracies in 20th century history, that America needed to beware of a slide toward totalitarianism. I warned that would-be tyrants on the left or the right always use a map to close down democracies, and that they always take the same 10 steps. Whether it's invoke a terrifying internal and external threat, or create a thug caste, or target the press, or the final step, suspend the rule of law. These steps are always recognizable, and they always work to crush democracies and to establish tyrannies. At that time, the global threat, quote unquote, of terrorism was the specter that powers were invoking to attack our freedoms. And by the way, often the terrifying internal and external threat is a real thing like terrorism, but it's exaggerated or hyped or weaponized. So that book was widely read and discussed, both at the time of its publication and for the last 12 years. And periodically, people would ask me when and if we had reached step 10. We, my brave publisher Chelsea Green and I, are releasing the first and last chapters of The End of America now in February of 2021. And I'm calling the sequel to this book Step 10. I'm writing it now because as of March of last year, I'm sorry to say, we have indeed arrived at and begun to inhabit Step 10 of the 10 steps to fascism. Though in 2008, I did not explicitly foresee that a medical pandemic would be the vehicle for moving the entire globe into Step 10, I have at various times warned of the dangers of medical crises to be used as vehicles for tyranny to justify suppressions of civil rights. Today, a much-hyped medical crisis has taken on the role of being used as a pretext to strip us all of core freedoms, and it's succeeding where fears of terrorism did not succeed. In 2015, I warned that infectious diseases could be used as a justification for ushering in suppressions of civil liberties, always under the guise of emergency measures. In 2019, a book of mine, Outrages, Sex, Censorship, and the Criminalization of Love, described how terrible infectious diseases epidemics in the 19th century in the British states, such as cholera and typhus, had been exploited as a way to invade people's privacy and crush freedoms at that time. The book was initially canceled, and its message of warning has been continually assailed. But that book, too, was prescient. In early March of 2020, of course, a global pandemic was announced, as I mentioned, COVID-19. In the immediate wake of the announcement, and in the narrativization of the pandemic, most of the elements of a locked-in 360-degree totalitarianism have been put into place in most of the countries in the West, including what had been robust democracies. And it all happened very quickly and very comprehensively. In the United States, we now have emergency measures in many states. Number one, these suspend the due process of law. This is the hallmark of a police state. COVID-19 is invoked as the reason for the introduction of emergency law, but there is no end point for lifting these emergency laws. Number two, the closures of schools, which breaks the social contract with the next generation. Number three, bills are being passed for vaccine passports, which bypass the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which forbids unwarranted search and seizure, and allows the government and big tech companies to intrude on medical privacy and to create a comprehensive digital surveillance state. Number four is forced closures of businesses, so the suspension of property rights. By intervening directly in the economy and allowing certain businesses to flourish, like Amazon, Walmart, and Target, at the expense of small businesses, Main Street shops, restaurants, and sole proprietor businesses in general, the state has merged government and corporations in a way that's really more characteristic of Italian fascism in the 20s or of modern Chinese communism. Indeed, the fact that tech stocks rose by 27% in just one quarter of the pandemic shows that one driver of this war against human freedoms and human society is that every minute human beings spend in a classroom or at a pub or restaurant or in a church or synagogue, that is time that tech companies, from their point of view, lose money by being unable to harvest that data. COVID policies are driven by something called the COVID-19 Response Project. This is made up of tech companies like Google, Microsoft, Zoom, Nintendo. These got together to ensure that there would be messaging to inhibit human beings from being allowed to connect except via digital platforms. And the reason for this is profit as well as social control. Number 5 is restrictions on assembly. Some states, such as California, are fining people for seeing their friends in their homes or making it unlawful for kids to have play dates with their friends. Massachusetts restricted gatherings of more than 10 people at a time, so did New York, forcing synagogues and churches to stay closed in spite of a Supreme Court ruling against states forcing churches to close. Parks and playgrounds and beaches have been closed off. In countries such as Britain, people are fined for leaving their homes for more than an hour's exercise a day, and they're forbidden from seeing their loved ones, even if they're sick, if they're outside of a narrow radius. Forced face coverings is number 6. In Massachusetts, people are fined if they're not wearing masks outdoors. Even children as young as 5 are forced to do so by law. Again, this mandate has not been undergirded by peer-reviewed studies showing any medical necessity, and there's no endpoint offered for these extraordinary violations of personal freedom. Number 7 is suppression of free speech. Big tech companies are censoring critics of COVID policy and of vaccine policy, as well as censoring views that are on the right hand of the political spectrum. Incitement, which is a word that has a long history in the 20th century of closing down free speech, has been weaponized from the left, I'm sorry to say, as a member of the left, to shut down First Amendment freedoms of expression. In other forms of censorship and management of speech and public debate, tycoons such as Bill Gates have been funding major news outlets with millions of dollars directed to, quote, COVID education. And these millions are going to the New York Times, to NPR, to The Guardian, to the BBC, and so on. As a result, dissenting voices are marginalized and shamed, or even threatened with legal action or job loss. Number 8, science has been hijacked in the interest of biofascism, as I call it, by heavily funding commentators from the scientific world, such as Dr. Fauci in the US, who just got $1 million from Israel and makes $500,000 a year, more than any other government employee. Imperial College and Sage in the UK, Dr. Christian Drosten in Germany, a dominant set of policies and pronouncements about COVID that benefit a small group of bad actors, notably tech and pharma companies, as I mentioned, but governments in general who like control, have kind of crafted credentialed supporters. But when other scientists or institutions seek out debate or transparency, like the 20 scientists who pointed out that the peer-reviewed study showing that PCR tests are accurate was rushed through peer review in 24 hours, when usually it takes hundreds of days or over 100 days, they are threatened with job loss or reputationally attacked, as in the case of Dr. Simon Godecke of the Netherlands. Number 9, data, too, have been hijacked to serve the interests of this biofascism. And this manipulation of truth, which I foreshadowed in The End of America, is really typical of Soviet censors. COVID platforms such as COVID-19 tracking and Johns Hopkins University are funded by technocrats such as Michael Bloomberg, who owns COVID-19 tracking now and who funds Johns Hopkins University's database. These serve unverifiable COVID data that directly affect the stock markets. Again, while this un-American merger of corporate interests and public policy is reminiscent of Italian fascism, the twist provided by digital data presentation and its relationship to the stock market is very much of the 21st century. There have been attacks on religious minorities, as I mentioned, and this is all part of what is number 10, policies that weaken bonds between human beings and weaken the family. These have been introduced and they're being policed. And this is the most serious development of all. And these policies really, again, are typical of China, which tries to have the state be the ultimate arbiter of children rather than parents. The new biofascism in the West, very much, as I mentioned, driven by big tech leaders and soon to be exploited, many thoughtful commentators fear, geopolitically by major powers such as China, which wants to be the global preeminent power as soon as possible, is a war against free human beings and against the qualities that make us human. Masks break down human beings' ability to bond face to face and to enjoy human contact, smiles and jokes. Masks turn down the effectiveness of human, quote, technology, essentially, by making it hard for us to, quote, read each other and pick up social cues. Forbidding assembly keeps us from forming human alliances against these monstrous interests. Forbidding human assembly also prevents new cultures, new heroes, and new ideas from arising. We are all stuck with the Rolodex and the ideas and contacts that we had in March of 2020. It's basically a war against culture itself, human culture, which requires human interaction. Forcing kids to distance at school and wear masks ensures a generation of Americans who don't know how to form human alliances and who don't trust their own human instincts. Those are counter-revolutionary training techniques, creating a generation of children who will be zombies or ciphers and who will follow authority no matter how nonsensical and mad. I'm hearing many reports of children really being abused by public schools, such as being forced to eat their lunch facing a wall or being told no mask, no voice, not being allowed to speak to their friends at lunchtime. Terrifying child abuse in the name of COVID. Driving all learning onto already prepared distance learning platforms ensures that kids do not know how to behave in human space that's not mediated by technology. Many COVID policies seem designed to ensure that humans will have no, quote, analog space left or analog culture left. And what do I mean by that? No way to feel comfortable simply gathering in a room, touching one another as friends or allies joining together. By analog space, I mean space that humans own, that isn't mediated by a third party, by a government, by a corporation, a bookstore, a library, a school, a synagogue, a church. These are analog spaces. Paper, books, these are analog items of culture. Nothing can take those away from humans. Humans don't have to buy them. They serve human interests and humans own the outcomes. Those are analog spaces. Lastly, driving all human interaction onto Zoom, which is a window for the Chinese Communist Party, as China owns the platform, is not only a way to harvest all of the West's technology, business secrets, and IP. It is a way to ensure that intimacy and connection in the future will be done online. I mean, you can only breathe freely in your home online. Why would you put on a mask and go see another human being whose expression you can't even decipher? All human connection in the future will be done online, and that human face-to-face contact will be killed off. Why is this, you might ask? Why develop these policies that punish, encumber, and restrict human contact in analog, and by that I mean unsurveilled, unmediated human spaces? Because human contact is the greatest revolutionary force when it comes to human freedom and resistance to this form of comprehensive biofascism, the biofascism represented by the new normal, the medico-fascist step 10. Let me recap from the year 2008 and read you my intro to The End of America, as well as the warning at the close of that book. Its message has never, sadly, been more timely. This time, threats to freedom justified by terrorism then have reclothed themselves in the trappings of a medical pandemic. But this time, we do not just face a war on freedom. This time we face a war on human beings themselves and on everything that makes us human.